What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and we are preparing for the next set of regional championships featuring the modern format actually taking place the weekend that this video is getting uploaded and going well into mid-March, where we're going to be seeing a lot of high-level Magic taking place and some players realizing their dreams of getting to play on the Pro Tour, and for a very lucky select few that can maybe manage to win those events, or in the case of the United States, make it to the finals of the regional championship, can even get a spot in the World Magic Championship, which will be taking place in Las Vegas later this year. It's always exciting. I think the regional championships definitely have some of the highest levels of a competition that you can play, really play against in any given region. And, the United States historically having some massive regional championships. I believe even the Washington, D.C. one I went to had like almost 1,800 players, and it was just an insane amount of people, specifically like in the United States and some other regions of the country. But that's neither here nor there. This is a time where players are practicing extra hard, and for people like us, we're going to be kind of studying the metagame and preparing ourselves for what we kind of expect to see in the coming weeks and the coming months of these regional championships. Again, this is a lot of high-level competition. You're going to see a lot of people just registering what are perceived to be the best decks in the format. You have some other people making some more, off-meta choices to try and, metagame a little bit, maybe try to just go a step ahead and say, I'm going to play these decks because I think that these are going to be the most played decks, and I'm going to just try to beat up on them all weekend to try and get my qualification for the Pro Tour. But that's exactly what we're going to be doing here in this video. We're going to be looking at the modern format. We're going to break down the metagame, kind of look at what decks that players are going to be looking to play, the decks that are really to beat, and I think the best decks, best perceived decks of the modern format. And we're going to, of course, give some thoughts and predictions on how this whole series of events can go. Obviously, this is massive. Again, this is what a lot of players are playing for. This is the next step from those regional championship qualifiers that you play in, is to go play in these regional championships. They're a lot of fun to go to, especially in the United States. They have Star City Games hosting the event, and they put on a really good show. Of course, there's going to be live coverage at this event. There's also a ton of great artists, ton of great content creators, and of course, tons of vendors where you can buy some very nice, shiny rectangles of cardboard that may or may not be interesting to you, and tons of side events as well. So that's going to be our plan today. We're going to get you prepared for the regional championship, whether you're playing in it, whether you're watching it at home. It's always going to be a great time, so strap in and we'll get into it. But of course, a few things that I would like to mention. If you are not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk mainly about the modern standard format, as well as some other longer form videos, we really dive into the competitive aspects of Magic the Gathering. So if that is something that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Of course, if you enjoy this at any point, you learn something, whatever the case may be, leave a like on the video, leave a comment down below as well. I like interacting with the community. I want to know what you think is the best deck going into the modern format, into this regional championship season, because again, I think this is going to be super important. This is basically a brand new metagame. This is going to be one of the biggest tournaments since the banning of the One Ring and Amped Raptor, and of course, Jingatha, probably the most impactful card of all the ones that got banned. And of course, the unbanning of some very powerful cards like Mox Opal and Faithless Looting finally being reintroduced to the format, as well as Green Sun Zenith and Splinter Twin. So, like to know what you think in the comments down below. Of course, follow me on Twitch as well, so you know when we go live and play some sweet decks in the modern format, play some standard, just kind of hang out. It's kind of a fun thing to do. Lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Manatraders is a monthly subscription service where you can rent cards online to play on Magic the Gathering online. You can go play in different leagues and challenges on Moto. You could even participate in Manatraders monthly series where you could potentially qualify for their invitational championship at the end of the year. Use my code in the description down below. You get 5% off your monthly subscription. I'd like to thank Manatraders for being the sponsor of the video and the sponsor of the channel, and let's go ahead and dive into the modern metagame. So here we have a quick kind of snapshot of what the modern metagame looks like, and I think this is something that you can really heavily expect. These are a lot of the decks that you see performing very well in the modern challenges online, and really what people have been having a lot of success with for probably even the last few months, even like pre-ban Modern as well. So first we have Boros Energy. We're going to go into specifically, Boros Energy, Dimir, Murktide, and Grinding Station here in a minute. Those are the decks we're going to focus on because I believe that those are kind of the decks to beat going into this regional championship season. So we have Boros Energy. This is essentially the big bad of the format. Pre-ban and post-ban, it has just still been a very powerful deck. Obviously, a lot less powerful when you get rid of something like Amped Raptor, which is still funny that it actually is kind of like the picture preview of this card, and says that it's still played in the deck, even though this is from decks from the last 14 days, so pretty interesting there. But, this is just kind of like a very aggressive, very powerful deck. It snowballs out of control, and even with some of the best cards that have ever existed in Modern being banned from the deck, it has not really lost stride and has continued to proven to at least be a top 3 deck in the format, and again, one that you could argue is the best deck in the format and one of the most consistent decks in the format. Dimir Murktide is another one of those decks that is probably more on the interactive side. You end up having the safety net of kind of like counter spells of various different varieties, whether in name or just in function. And then you also get to play the very powerful Psychic Frog in conjunction with something like Abhorrent Oculus to have some pretty nutty starts, at least, pretty aggressive starts, I would say, from a blue-black deck. And of course, you just get to cap it all off with Murktide and just the little intricacies and consistencies and the camaraderie, I guess, is the best word I can come up with, because I got fog brain really bad. But nonetheless, this is a very powerful Dimir deck. It can play kind of like this, blue-black, like mid-rangey deck, but there's also a lot of ways that it can just completely snowball out of control and get to the board very early and be very aggressive, while also playing a little bit more of a control style when it needs to. So just very flexible. I think one of the more difficult decks to play, certainly not the most difficult of the big 3, but I would say definitely harder than Boros Energy, and definitely easier than the third deck we're going to talk about, which is Grinding Station, a deck that has completely went from 50 to 100 in a matter of seconds thanks to the card Mox Opal, which allowing it to kind of enable some pretty crazy like turn 1s to set up a lot of turn 2 kills, even with playing through some interaction. It's a deck that definitely is pretty reliant on its graveyard, and graveyard hate just seems to be kind of ticking up higher and higher. And I would expect Grinding Station to kind of be a deck that is one of the best decks in the format, and I've seen it just do absolutely crazy things. But I also don't expect it to see a very high number of players playing it, because it's not really a deck that you can really pick up and play. I think that there's some very straightforward like patterns and straightforward lines of play that can win you the game, but is not necessarily just a deck that is like a plug and play where like, oh, I'm going to play this and I'm just going to start winning every tournament. You are definitely super paid off by like the deeper intricacies of the deck. And if you want to learn even more about these decks, of course, we're going to talk about them here, but if you want even more, I actually have individual deck techs for all these on my channel if you want to go and check those out. Wrapping things up here, we have Eldrazi Ramp and Belcher. I would say that these are pretty good like counter meta picks. Eldrazi Ramp seeing a ton of play as of here recently. It's a deck that can just create a ton of mana early on. You can go into Sowing Myco Spawns on like turn 2, which allow you to then put more lanes into play, potentially set up Tron, just create more mana to cast your Eldrazi spells, and then just overwhelm your opponent with Haymaker after Haymaker. I'm not exactly sure what matchups like are, really the finer intricacies of like, well, it's good against this but bad against that. But typically like these counterspell-ish type decks, when they want to kind of play a control game and they're not really putting pressure on you, these kind of ramp decks just kind of tend to take over the game. So if none of these decks are really interacting or killing the Eldrazi ramp deck very efficiently, then you could just see Eldrazi ramp absolutely just take over a game by just, again, ramping with their creatures and then stone raining you on top of just putting big threats into play that your efficient spells really can't answer very efficiently. Belcher was a deck that we'd seen quite a bit towards the end of the modern RCQ season. Of course, it was just a hard counter to Boros Energy. I mean, it just never seemed like Boros Energy could beat it. It was a deck that could just put Goblin Char Belcher into play and then just one-shot your opponent all in the same turn, not really giving your opponent an avenue to really interact with the Belcher. Once it was on the board, you were going to be able to play it and then activate it, throw it at your opponent, and say GG's. On the last like 5-ish decks we're going to look at here, because I mean we have some of these, but like Dimir Breach is essentially the grinding station deck we're talking about. Living In seeing a little bit more play. The Rock is something that players have been kind of messing around with. Affinity also has been kind of sweet, but really these are kind of like what we're going to be looking at here as we kind of get closer. Orzhov Midrange is also kind of this new like control-ish deck where, you know, you're able to just get a ton of value. You're able to get an Overlord of the Baelmark into play on turn 3, while also again getting to double up on some of its ETB and getting to attack with it as early as turn 4, and just getting to play a bunch of creatures and being able to get a creature every turn that is just going to be able to disrupt your opponent, and an Aether Vial style deck that is just going to allow you to play multiple creatures with very good enter the battlefield abilities each turn. It's just going to be an annoying deck to deal with overall that, you know, is in a color combination that I think interacts very favorably with graveyards and creature decks. We have Amulet Titan. This is another deck that is very complicated, that has some very straightforward lines that I think most people can kind of gather and figure out, but when you're really trying to get down to the nitty gritty and you don't necessarily have the perfect setup every single time, you don't have, you know, no interaction from your opponent, and they're actually able to, you know, pretty easily interact with you, is trying to figure out like, okay, how do I cobble together a win, or how do I put myself in a position where I'm very low percentage to lose, or my opponent can't really get out of the situation, whatever the case may be, you know. And that's really the big thing from these Amulet Titan decks, is that it is a very difficult deck to play, and it's always just a very good deck. It's just trying to play it optimally to the point where it's worth playing a deck like this instead of playing something like Boros Energy. Obviously, by the meta percentage, players that seem to be opting for literally anything else really other than Amulet Titan, but this is a deck that is played by so many dedicated players that have put hours and hours and hours, and that's just putting it lightly, into playing this deck and finding the most optimal builds and optimal ways of playing this deck, that you're going to see some amount of this show up at these regional championships, and the players that do show up with this are more than likely going to be performing very well with this deck, barring obviously, you know, the variance of Magic the Gathering. Ruby Storm is one of the fastest combo decks, kind of like Grinding Station, where thanks to Mox Opal, it now has a ton of different ways to kill on turn 2. This just always had a bunch of ways to kill on turn 2, and can kind of race some of the interaction that your opponent's going to have for like your graveyard, or just for like your spells based kind of deck. People are always just packing random hate for this deck. But that being said, another deck that is just very powerful. It's very fast, and if you can run hot with it, you know, it's a very hard deck to beat, because again, you just end up winning game 1s like at an absurdly high rate, and you just got to figure out how to win game 2 or game 3. And in my personal experience playing the deck, that's really just how it goes, is you can win a lot of game 1s through a lot of dumb stuff, whether you're winning the game on turn 2, whether you're winning on like turn 8, doesn't really matter. It's just trying to figure out how to win those 2 sideboard games. Mardu Midrange, it kind of fits into like the Boros Energy package, where, you know, this kind of beats up on Boros Energy with a lot of the black cards, plus you're able to play things like Thoughtseize, so you can kind of interact with some of these other like combo-y / like critical mass style decks, where you can just take one of their key pieces and you're still playing like the Boros Energy game plan, so you're just also getting to do the Boros Energy things while, you know, partially having to take a turn off to, you know, be disruptive in those sort of ways. You can just then, again, play as a Boros Energy deck from that point on, and just kind of put your opponent through the ringer and really force them to have to interact while also having to play through the proactive interaction that you have. Lastly, we have Yawgmoth. I think Yawgmoth is, I don't know if it's necessarily a sleeper pick. It's just a deck that always is kind of like not really taken seriously, I would think. You know, there's a lot of times where Yawgmoth could have been easily one of the best decks, or at least a top 2, top 3 deck, and it just always seemed to be kind of like one step behind what people perceived as like the best deck in the format, but people still play this in a high number. And while I've been watching a lot of like Demonic Tutors, absolutely love him, you know, Meet MTG, and it seems like even like Young Dingo and stuff like that are playing a lot of Yawgmoth, and just kind of trying to figure out a list to play in these regional championships based on Yawgmoth. I think that with the addition of like Green Sun Zenith, and of course all the other kind of pieces it gets to play in the deck, that I would not be surprised that this deck performed very well. Maybe not necessarily winning a regional championship. I mean, I obviously could be wrong, but I think that you can also kind of bet on Yawgmoth to have at least a few players do very well with it, because it's a deck that players kind of know what's going on, but there's so many other intricate tricks and stuff like that that once they kind of dig lower, they just find more and more tunnels to kind of explore and, you know, go down this path of like, oh, like I didn't realize that we could do this. I didn't realize we could do that. And just like most of these decks, if you are a dedicated Yawgmoth player, you're able to go pretty deep with this deck, then you can kind of get to a point where you can kind of like outsmart your opponents in ways, because they're going to make a play that I think most of the time is like good, but then because you have that knowledge, you have special ways of like punishing those sort of plays. So definitely these would be the decks that I would be expecting. I'll link the modern metagame page for MTG Goldfish so you can kind of check out these decks yourself. But we will be going deeper into what I consider the big three and kind of ranking them in a way by going over them relatively quickly and just kind of trying to get you to understand like the more intricate, like how these decks actually win the game. So here we have Boros Energy. This is the currently most played deck in the modern format, according to MTG Goldfish, and it's crazy to think that that's still the case, considering that the One Ring and Amp Raptor were pretty big parts of this deck, just being able to extract as much value as possible and just be able to dump its hand, which it really wants to do, as soon as possible, and then be able to refill with the One Ring. So with kind of all those changes being made, you would think that this deck would take a hit, but instead it has continued to kind of not necessarily dominate the format in a way that it used to, but is still considered one of the best decks in the format. And it's pretty easy to see why, when one of the best 1-2 punches in modern right now is Guide of Souls and Ocelot Pride. These two just feed off of each other. Guide of Souls gaining you a life and an energy when another creature enters the battlefield, also being an energy outlet in itself, allowing you to put 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on a target attacking creature, and it becomes an angel, whatever, but you get to do this for 3 mana whenever you attack, which is pretty easy to get up to that amount of energy, thanks to, you know, Guide of Souls really getting going, and just, again, how many creatures you're able to put on the board. Ocelot Pride, whenever you gain life, is going to make a 1/1 cat at the end step, and then if you have the City's Blessing, which means if you have 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game, even if you dip below 10 permanents, and then if you have the City's Blessing when this ability triggers, you make a cat, and then you make a copy of each token that has been made that turn. So this is, in the worst case, a way that you can make, you know, 2 cat tokens a turn, which doesn't seem very amazing, but unlike a lot of these like 2-card combos where, you know, something like Cat Oven that you'd see in Pioneer, you definitely want multiple ovens and like 1 cat, maybe a second one, because if you have the inverse where you have like 2 or 3 cats and 1 oven, it doesn't really matter because you're only able to perform that loop of draining your opponent once, where, you know, Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, both are just amazing. If you have 1 Guide of Souls and like 3 Ocelot Prides, then you're going to be making a ton of cat tokens and going even wider, considering that you'll get the City's Blessing much faster. You'll be able to then overwhelm your opponent with a ton of cats. On the other side, if you have multiple Guide of Souls and just 1 Ocelot Pride, you're going to be gaining a ton of energy every turn, and then you're going to be able to get a bunch of triggers from Guide of Souls to then put +1/+1 counters on those creatures, and then have your creatures essentially fly over your opponent's creatures and apply massive pressure to their life total. So this is really cool if you're playing it, of course, because again, like, this is something where you can play this 2-card combo. You want to play this 2-card combo, you have a great outlet. This is a way that you can go wide and even go tall as well. And if you draw an overwhelming amount of one instead of the other, or if you draw like 3 copies of one and 1 of the other, in either scenario, you're pretty okay with kind of what's going on. Outside of that, there is Johnny Nakado Pariah. This is a way that we can kind of even abuse, making even more cats, where if you don't necessarily have Guide of Souls going, but you do have Ocelot Pride, if you're able to flip a Johnny Nakado Pariah with the help of some other cards that we have in the deck, you're able to put a +1/+1 counter on each cat you control. And when you have a board full of 4 or 5 cats, just putting a +1/+1 counter on all of them is going to add an additional 5 power to the board, on top of allowing to activate its ability, to where you can then just leave your opponent with 1 creature and then be able to attack with a board full of pumped up cats. That's really cool. You also have Goblin Bombardment. Super simple. Sacrifice a creature, deal 1 damage to any target creature or player. This also is going to help you flip a Johnny's to get to the point where you can even use its 0 ability to make cat tokens and shoot your opponent equal to the number of creatures you control. Goblin Bombardment also is like a way that you can add reach to your deck, where you attack with a bunch of cat creature tokens, you put your opponent down to 8, you have 8 creatures, you just sack them all, target your opponent, and kill them, not really out of nowhere, because obviously it's face up on the table, but that's kind of the general idea. You're going to see a lot of these decks trying to go really wide and just try to pressure your opponent super early on in the game, metagame, try to nullify a lot of their targeted removal, and then you're going to be able to just shoot your opponent for the rest of the damage. But even if that plan doesn't work either, you know, these are some very powerful cards. Flage is probably just on rate one of the singular best creatures. I would say that Ocelot Pride in conjunction with Guide of Souls is probably like the best set of like creatures you can play. Flage Titan of Fire's Fury is probably one of the best creatures, period. It's got a Lightning Helix for 3 mana, and then you can escape it for 2 and 2 white. And thanks to this card, Arena of Glory, that was printed in Modern Horizons 3 alongside this, it makes it a very, very, very potent option to just close out a game out of nowhere, or just pick off a bunch of creatures in your opponent's board, attack for 6, and make it impossible for them to really beat it by just beating it in combat. They're going to need a removal spell, and it's going to be a very persistent threat for the rest of the game. Seasoned Pyromancer is a new addition. Of course, we lost the One Ring, so Seasoned Pyromancer's here. You can make a ton of tokens, and then if you have, with Ocelot Pride, it's kind of the cool thing. For Seasoned Pyromancer and Fable, if you're able to get an Ocelot Pride trigger, you're going to be able to double the tokens that you make with Seasoned Pyromancer. You're going to be able to double the treasure tokens that you make with the Goblin Shaman, and even double the Goblin Shaman token itself. So really, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and of course, you have other energy outlets and Galvanic Discharge, Static Prison, just very efficient removal spells that are going to deal with any problematic permanent you need, or any creature or planeswalker that your opponent could play. Galvanic Discharge is going to scale up as you go, because you can kill an early threat for 1 or 2 energy, then you end up having 1 or 2 energy left over, and you're able to then kill bigger and bigger targets. A Thraben Charm, you're going wide. This is essentially going to be a Doomblade on most creatures, and of course, going to have some utility in getting rid of enchantments, and with some of the graveyard decks that are seeing play, especially in the Grinding Station deck, this is going to be a very good option as well. And that's kind of where this deck kind of sits and why it's one of the best decks. And again, I think very simple to play in compared to something like Frog or the Grinding Station deck that we're going to be talking about here in a moment. But overall, this is a deck that you can definitely go A, B to C and just easily overwhelm your opponent. And as long as you have some really good sequencing, and even partly if your draws kind of line up, you can end up just really overwhelming and beating your opponent in any which way. Like, it really puts a lot of pressure on your opponent's like counter spells and removal spells to kind of disrupt this deck and stop it from what it wants to do. And to me, that's why it's one of the best decks in the format, and why I would be very, very, very surprised if we went through all these regional championships and Boros Energy didn't win at least 1, maybe 2 of those regional championships. But there's other decks in the format that are worth playing and arguably have some pretty good matchups against Boros Energy. So let's take a look at the next most popular deck in the format, and I think one that players are going to be fine-tuning, and something that we're not going to see just set on a solid list, where I think Boros Energy, for the most part, I think is pretty locked in and standard to where it's at. You're going to see a few numbers fluctuate. This deck, I could see like wildly different takes taken upon it for whatever expected metagame there is to, give yourself the best chance to actually win with said deck. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Dimir Frogtide decks. So here we have just a Dimir Murktide list I pulled up, as I kind of stated before getting into just the list in general, or what this deck is trying to do. A lot of it is kind of centered around the same few things, but a lot of the other spells are kind of in this weird flex spot. There's actually a pretty good video by the Control Freak, and even Merc Guides also does a very good job, and they do a very thorough dive into kind of what these Dimir Murktide decks are looking to do, whether they're leaning more into Murktide Regent, more into the Abhorrent Oculus plan, whatever like some of these flex cards are. But a lot of the things stay the same, and what I think is probably one of the better ways of having the deck built, of course, is Psychic Frog and this sort of combo it has with the card Unearth. So Unearth is a card that says that you can return a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It can also cycle if you really needed to, but this kind of sets up some situations where like you can play Psychic Frog on turn 2, you untap on your turn 3, ideally with the frog intact. You end up drawing a card, you discard an Abhorrent Oculus to the Psychic Frog to put a +1/+1 counter on it. You attack with it, get in some damage, draw your card, and then you're able to play a third land and cast Unearth on your Abhorrent Oculus, getting around the additional cost of exiling 6 cards from your graveyard, which is going to be helpful because then we are able to activate Psychic Frog's ability to give it flying at some point, or just leave food in our graveyard for Murktide Regent, and then we're going to be able to manifest Dread on our opponent's upkeep as long as the Oculus gets to stick around. This is a pretty powerful start. Obviously, with 2 mana after that, you see we have a ton of 1 and 2 mana plays here, and again, a lot of these cards can kind of be flexed out. There's been some versions that are playing absolutely 0 counter spells all the way up to 4 counter spells. We see Drown the Lock kind of making the list here. This isn't necessarily a very normal card that decks are playing, but this player opted for at least a one of Shoot the Sheriff, another 2-mana removal spell, something else that they've opted for, and then a bunch of 1-mana spells and Thought Scour, Stern Scolding, just being able to interact with some of the early creatures, is actually interacting very well with Boros Energy. Fatal Pushes, Consider, Spell Snares, those cards are the like. You also, like when you cast your Frog on turn 2, there is a very good chance that you can just force a negation whatever spell it is and just be able to protect your Frog, because you're going to be able to kind of get the cards back and lower a little bit of the downside impact that Force Negation has by forcing you to exile a blue card from your hand to essentially counter a spell and exile it from your opponent. So really a lot of what this deck is trying to do is kind of center around Psychic Frog. A Psychic Frog is a very hard card to beat if you're not able to get rid of it on turn 2, and even with some of the damage-based removal, or like with the Galvanic Discharges that we talked about, if your opponent doesn't have really any energy reserves kind of stored up, or if they're trying to play something like Lightning Bolt, or even Dismember, you are going to pretty easily be able to allow the Psychic Frog to live, and there is at least a few stories where players have just essentially mind-twisted themselves to Psychic Frog to get it to survive whatever damage or whatever destroy effects that are not, destroy target creature effects, and then just going and winning the game because their opponent is now on essentially a 2 to 3 turn clock with the Frog, and they're not really going to be able to effectively block it because they're going to be able to give it flying and deal a bunch of damage to your opponent, and of course drawing extra cards as well to again kind of get up to that point where okay, I can either discard more cards to this to make it bigger to then just close out the game immediately, or just hold on to these spells and be able to interact with what my opponent has going on. All great, wonderful stuff here. And again, like we talk about how this deck can definitely differ, and it's really here in the spells. Like you'll see maybe some opting for like 2 Murktide Region and one of the Graveyard Trespassers is kind of like a popular card that some of these decks had been playing. So you'll see like a little bit of a change there, but ultimately like this is kind of where it sits, is like 4 Frog, 4 Oculus, and then either 2 or 3 Murktide Region, and then maybe one of like another set of cards, maybe something like Harbinger of the Seas, essentially just being a Blood Moon type effect, but turning them into islands, which is arguably better than creating red mana, considering that some of the best decks in the format do just want red mana instead of having blue mana. But that's really kind of where this deck stands, and Frog is definitely the linchpin of this. Again, with its discard ability, you're able to enact the Oculus plan that we talked about. You're also able to essentially give food to Murktide Region to have it come down even sooner than maybe like the 4th turn of the game. You are also able to then exile cards from your graveyard with the Frog that are also going to grow the Murktide Region, given if they are instant or sorcery cards, so that you can kind of surprise lethal your opponent out of nowhere just by exiling cards from your graveyard, give it flying, exile more cards, give it flying. Like, all right, I'm attacking with like a 6/7 Frog and like a 14/14 Murktide Region, which is going to be nearly impossible for your opponent to actually take off the board. And this is also in corner cases where your opponent does decide to, exile your Murktide Region with like a static prison. You are able to get it back, and Frog can exile cards from the graveyard to then regrow the Murktide Region to a bigger dragon to, again, hopefully close out games. This is a deck that, again, I think is more difficult than Boros Energy, because Boros Energy kind of has one way of going, and it's like trying to sequence your spells in the best possible way to get as much value as possible, while also maintaining some aggression on your opponent, and essentially knowing when and when not to attack with like certain creatures. And even with Guide of Souls, sometimes it doesn't even really matter. You can just attack with one creature, give it flying, and then just make it bigger than whatever else your opponent can possibly play to like deal with your stuff. Where I think this deck is definitely more mid-rangey feeling, where you can play this really aggressive game plan where you're just going like Psychic Frog on 2 into unearthing Abhorrent Oculus on turn 3 and being able to leave up like Counterspell or even play like a removal spell and continue to get in damage with Frog, and then of course start making out a bigger board with Abhorrent Oculus, or playing this kind of control strategy where you're playing Frog and you're just trying to more or less keep cards in hand. Maybe you discard one off card to it and you just kind of grow the Frog up to a 2 on the 2nd turn, 3 to the 3rd turn, whatever, and then just be able to be content with drawing extra cards and just countering whatever spells your opponent plays, killing whatever creatures that they play, and then just kind of tempoing them out to the point where, okay, now we can just go all in on the Frog and win in a single turn. So it is definitely a deck that is a little bit more difficult in the sense that you have a lot of decisions to make with this deck, and there's a lot of important decisions. Sometimes it's just completely out of your hands. That's Magic. But in a lot of cases, you're going to be looking at like, okay, do I leave up Counterspell in this spot, or do I just play this other spell and I leave up like a 1 mana spell, or do I run out my threat, or do I wait a turn because I can play something like a spell snare or whatever to protect it. Those are the kind of things you have to think about with this deck. It inherently makes it difficult, but it is very satisfying and a lot of fun to play once you kind of like learn a lot of those big decisions. And then when you get to those kind of like micro decisions and things like that, where you maybe not have been in the spot and you're like, I wonder what's going to be the best course of action here, is a lot of fun and very satisfying. But that's the Dimir Murktide deck. The last one I think is probably borders on being one of the best decks in the format, but I think it is very, very, very difficult. But the rewards are absolutely insane given some of the nasty things that they can do. So lastly, we're going to take a look at the Grinding Breach deck and kind of explain the best we can what the heck is actually going on with that deck. So lastly, here we have the Grinding Station deck. This is kind of a weirder combo deck. It's definitely very reliant on your graveyard because you're going to be able to abuse some synergies and some very powerful cards ever printed in Magic to essentially go through your entire deck and win the game with everyone's favorite commander staple, Thassa's Oracle. So how you are trying to set this up is essentially getting to play a card, Underworld Breach, which says that each 9-lane card in your graveyard has escape, except its escape cost is equal to the mana value of that card, plus exiling 3 cards from your graveyard, and at the end step you sacrifice Underworld Breach. But it's not really going to matter because the only end that is happening in this game when Underworld Breach resolves is your opponent's. So you essentially are trying to get an Underworld Breach into play, and you want a card called a Grinding Station out as well. So this says that you can sacrifice an artifact, target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library in his or her graveyard, and whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Grinding Station. Yes, when it enters, it does untap itself. There are some cases where you can just play it, have its trigger on the stack, sack something, and then untap it, and then you have the ability to activate it again. So some pretty neat things. But as you can kind of notice, you mill 3 cards with Grinding Station. You need to exile 3 cards with Underworld Breach. You essentially have like a free way of being able to kind of do things with Underworld Breach to where you can mill your whole library if you have a 0-cost card. So ideally, you get a card like Mox Opal, or with Emery and Tamiyo in play, you can have a Mox Amber. This works that way as well. You can play the Mox Opal, exiling 3 cards from your graveyard, use the Grinding Station, sacrifice the Mox Opal to then mill yourself for 3 cards, and then obviously, ideally, you float a mana with the Mox Opal. I'm pretty sure I said that, but you know, my Goldfish attention span has completely let me down here. But you float a mana, you sacrifice it to the Grinding Station, you mill yourself for 3 cards, then you cast the Mox Opal again, exiling 3 cards, you float another mana, and then you can sacrifice it again, and you continue this loop over and over and over again until you get Thassa's Oracle in the graveyard, and we're able to maintain essentially 3 cards in our graveyard plus the spell that we want to cast. So we just end up floating a ton of blue mana or colors of whatever mana that we want, and then we can cast the Thassa's Oracle, and with 0 cards in our library, even if our opponent gets rid of the Thassa's Oracle, they get rid of all of our blue devotion. For some reason, Thassa's Oracle says that if your devotion is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game, meaning that the game is over. And that's kind of the main idea how this deck wins those kinds of games. Tamiyo is also sort of kind of a way that you can just like give your opponent absolutely 0 hope. Just by getting to draw a bunch of cards and then having no max hand size. So it just makes it even easier to kind of mill yourself naturally from that point instead of having the Grinding Station, Underworld Breach kind of combo going. And then, of course, this deck gets heavily hated by Graveyard Hate. We can even see some versions playing a Soul Guide Lantern in the main. This is something that you can get off of like Urza Saga, which is a very powerful card, and you know, can just kind of search some of these combo pieces here, like Mox Hammer, Mox Opal, Aether Spellbomb, and Soul Guide Lantern to get rid of, you know, creatures that might be stopping you from doing the combo, or just kind of give you an extra turn to kind of set up and eventually kill your opponent. Soul Guide Lantern getting rid of player's grave, or your opponent's graveyards, excuse me, or just getting to draw a card, and then it also exiles a card when it enters as well. Mishra's Bauble is also a very powerful card. Emery is a pretty big way of also kind of getting you there, where with depending on certain things that you have, you can actually just kind of Emery loop and just be able to, you know, cast a Mox from like your graveyard and then float a blue and then cast an Emery from your graveyard, and it's going to mill 4 cards and, you know, sacrifice to the Grind Stage, things like that. So you're able to kind of like loop Emerys with Underworld Breach as well as kind of like equal to like the mana cost, the mana value of things that you have. So, I mean, pretty insane stuff, like just from just the main deck. And then you kind of see on the sideboard here, you know, there's like Jace Wielder Mysteries, and there's Urza Lore High Artificer as like a way that you can just kind of abuse some of the like ways that you just mill yourself. Again, you have a game plan where you just can naturally just deck yourself, and then Jace is also going to help you get there. And of course, the ultimate, drawing 7 cards as well, and then you have no cards in your library, you win the game. Pretty sweet there. Urza, again, is like a way that you can just make a pretty huge construct along with other Urza Saga, other Urza Sagas being played to make constructs, and you can tap artifacts to add blue mana, and then for 5 mana, you can essentially get a ton of free value from Urza Lord High Artificer as well. So definitely a deck that you need to understand how to play against Graveyard Hate, but if you do kind of understand that, or if you just get really, really lucky, you can actually win a lot of games on turn 2 with this deck. It's not very uncommon to see your opponent play out a bunch of 0-mana artifacts, playing Emery on turn 1, which is going to unlock Mox Amber and Mox Opal, all at the same time, allowing you to add more mana to cast something like a Malevolent Rumble on your turn 1 to then just give you a ton of mana to work with on your next turn, to where you're going to be able to have enough mana to Grinding Breach plus Underworld Breach, or Grinding Station plus Underworld Breach, to then just start milling your deck and floating a ton of mana, and of course getting to Thassa's Oracle to then just kill your opponent. Emery also is like a good value engine as well, just by getting to like play Mishra's Bauble every turn. In the worst case, you're able to play it from your graveyard, crack it, and then draw a card in your opponent's turn, and then you draw a card for your turn, you play another one, so on and so forth. So you can just kind of get a ton of value, and it's very hard to kind of miss when you're drawing a card every single turn and your opponent's having to try to interact with their board and while also trying to kill you. And it's just, I think, very difficult, especially when this deck just does have some of those starts where it just gets to the board super quickly and just absolutely blows you out of the water when they get to win turn 2 on the play, and you got to have some kind of disruption that isn't really readily available for a lot of decks at 1 mana to kind of disrupt this combo. So that's it. That's really what you should know about some of the top decks of the Modern format. These are the decks that I would expect to see probably the most of, especially pretty late into day 2, into the top 8 of these events. Of course, there's a bunch of other decks that we could go over and kind of explain, I would think, relatively quickly, but I don't talk very quickly, or it really takes me a minute to get to the point here. But those are the decks that I would be most keeping an eye on for these regional championships going on. And of course, that we can see the format kind of take shape and evolve as we kind of get later into the season, as players just kind of figure out what exactly is successful, maybe kind of get an idea of what these metagames will look like, and we can see some of these like flex type cards kind of get taken out and maybe in favor of something different if we end up seeing a lot of energy, or if we see a lot of Murktide or Grinding Station in the near future. But, with that said, those are the decks that we looked at. Let's go ahead and give some thoughts and predictions of the regional championships and try to wrap this thing up. So, kind of what should we expect from the set of regional championships for the Modern format? Well, I think we're going to see some very diverse metagames. I think that Modern is in a spot right now where, yes, we outlined 3 decks that I think are just a tier above everything else. I think that they are going to easily be the decks to beat going into this regional championship season, and it's going to be interesting to see how players tackle it, if most of them just kind of gravitate towards playing one of these 3 decks, or if they try to go off the beaten path with something else. Maybe like Yawgmoth, I've seen has been pretty popular, I think, among a lot of people. Goblin Charbelcher also just naturally a very good deck against like Boros Energy, so if you're expecting a lot of energy, I would expect to see a lot of the Goblin Charbelcher decks, as well as, Ruby Medallion, Storm, whatever. Like, that deck is always just very powerful. A lot of people just playing Titan, because that is a deck that is always pretty good. And again, there's a lot of dedicated players who are very, very good and know about 18 to 20 different lines that they can perform at like half asleep at like 2 a.m. So that's just kind of like an idea of what we should see. So I would expect that this is probably one of the best Modern metagames that we're going to kind of see going into some of these events. I think it's maybe a little more cut and dry what is at the top of the metagame. I don't think it's so clear as to if there's like nothing else towards like the bottom tiers, or rather like the second or third tier of decks that could challenge them. I think that there is a lot going on in this format. There's a lot of nuance that we have to take, and I think overall that this is going to be an exciting set of regional championships to watch, even though I think that realistically this is probably like a 3, maybe 4 deck format that people could choose from and play, and I think would have a very high percentage of winning. But I think that's kind of indicative of a lot of metagames that we have, and I think it's easily one of the most diverse times of the modern format that we've had in quite a while, really, since the release of Modern Horizons 3. So my kind of easy predictions, I think some of these are like kind of softball-y. Like I think like Grinding Breach and Boros Energy are each going to win at least one regional championship. I leave the Oculus decks out of it just because I think that we're going to see a lot of different changes. There's going to be, I don't think nearly as many people. I think Boros Energy is going to win one just on sheer volume, and I think that, someone could just run super hot with Grinding Breach, win a lot of games on like turn 2 or turn 3, just have all the answers for all the graveyard hate, and there's just going to be a time where it's like, okay, that person is very clearly winning this event. So I think those decks are almost guaranteed to win at least one. The Oculus decks, I think, are going to perform very well. I just don't think they're going to be able to necessarily seal the deal. I think that, unless they go on like a really hot streak, it might be safe to say that all three of them will win at least one, but I think almost a guarantee that Grinding Breach and Boros Energy will win at least one of the regional championships taking place over the course of the next few months. Now, for the rest of them, I think I'm really interested in seeing what the Yawgmoth decks do, because as a former Yawgmoth, I shouldn't even say former Yawgmoth player, I mean, I still technically have like 95% of the deck built, but it's a deck that has gotten better, and it's like in a different boat than I would say the Oculus decks are, where they're trying to like fine tune some of those other options that they have, where it's like, okay, do I want more graveyard hate? Do I want artifact hate? Do I want just better like creature tutors? Do I want to kind of solidify my combo and have more things that I can do? Those are the kind of things that we're going to be looking at and seeing what takes place in the coming weeks. Of course, like an event going on just this weekend for the regional championship. It's going to be interesting to see kind of what decks like Yawgmoth end up doing. It's also going to be interesting to see how many people play Goblin Charbelcher. I would expect it to be one of the more played decks in the format, just because I think it has enough of the like free counter spells and disruption enough. I think it can do very well at certain few tournaments, as long as Boros Energy again continues to be one of the, like, we'll even say top 2 decks registered in the format, and I think maybe even to a point like a Grinding Station. I don't think it really wants to play against the Frogtide decks, but against Amped Raptor, or excuse me, against Boros Energy and the Grinding Station decks, I would kind of expect it to not really like go absolutely ham, but definitely be in the upper echelon of those decks and have a pretty high conversion rate if we see a lot of Boros Energy going late into day 1 into day 2. And that's really all I got for this regional championship season. I think it's going to be very exciting to watch the modern format kind of grow and evolve past this. We're going to be able to see if people are playing, Splinter Twin, if that's what they want, how many of the newly unbanned cards that we're going to have that are, potentially can make their mark on one of the biggest sets of modern Magic that we're going to be playing here for a while. Of course, I believe there's going to be a Pro Tour, but of course the regional championships are going to be kind of like this paper test, no pun intended, of what the modern metagame is going to look like and what players are going to opt to play, and if there are any kind of off-meta choices outside of that big 3 that can actually compete in the modern format and potentially take one of those top spots, or at least kind of hold those decks in check, or if they're going to be the best decks for a reason. They're going to show why they're the best decks in the format and continue to show players that, like, you should just be playing one of these 3 if you're going to pick something up, or be willing to just kind of continue on your journey with whatever other deck that you've kind of picked up and play, because I think there's a few that you do get a lot more percentage points in your favor, having pretty good matchups and understanding those matchups better than just kind of picking up Boros Energy or Dimir Frog and just trying to learn and play that deck, and if you're trying to get to a competent level of playing in a short period of time. But of course, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Again, please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, learned anything, whatever the case may be. I would appreciate, if you consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so when future videos get posted. And of course, check out the links in the description down below. We're going to be definitely talking about a lot of the regional championship stuff going on over on the Casual Spikes podcast. We're going to be streaming a bunch of Modern on Twitch, so go ahead and follow me over on Twitch. I would greatly appreciate that. Of course, check out the code for Manatraders if you want to kind of get into the formats and everything, and you don't really necessarily want to own a lot of the physical cards. You just want to play basically whatever you want at any time. Manatraders is the perfect way to do that. Go ahead and use my code sign up and get 5% off your monthly subscription. I do really appreciate that. Any support for the channel goes a very long way, and I do greatly appreciate it. But that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope to see you all in the next one.